Whispering Woods. Chapter 1. The Curse. The Whispering Woods had always been a place of legend in the small town of Oak Ridge. Thick trees, their twisted branches forever reaching like skeletal fingers, formed a dense canopy that plunged the forest floor into perpetual twilight. Strange sounds echoed from within: murmurs, footsteps, and at times, the eerie sound of children laughing. No one in Oak Ridge dared to venture past the edges. Everyone knew the stories. Generations had grown up hearing the warnings. Never enter the Whispering Woods. The tales told of those who entered and never returned, swallowed by something ancient and unseen. The unlucky few who made it out babbled incoherently about dark figures lurking between the trees and voices calling their names, dragging them deeper into the maze of shadows. Some claimed the forest had a will of its own, that it chose who would vanish. But despite these warnings, there were always the curious. Some were lured by the promise of unraveling the mystery, while others were drawn by the challenge of surviving a night within. One such group was gathering now at the edge of the forest. Mike, the town's reckless daredevil, stood with a grin on his face, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Next to him, Sarah, the quiet one with a fascination for the paranormal, shifted nervously, casting quick glances toward the darkened treeline. Peter, tall and brooding, kept his arms crossed, a skeptical smirk tugging at his lips. Rounding out the group was Claire, Mike's girlfriend, who had a determined set to her jaw despite the apprehension in her eyes. "This is stupid," Sarah muttered, hugging herself against the chill that had settled over the group the moment they'd approached the woods. "You know the stories. That's all they are, stories," Mike replied, his voice tinged with confidence. "And besides, people have gone in and come out." "Barely," Sarah shot back. "And they've never been the same after," Peter scoffed. "It's just trees and shadows. We'll be fine." But deep down, each of them felt it. The cold that wasn't from the wind, the subtle pull coming from the heart of the forest, like it was watching them, waiting. As they crossed the threshold into the forest, the air seemed to change, growing heavier, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching on the dried leaves beneath. The thick trees closed in around them, swallowing the sky, plunging them into a twilight world. And then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but unmistakable. The voices seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Low, indistinct, they floated on the air, brushing against their ears like the touch of a cold hand. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Mike replied, though the grin had slipped from his face. He could hear it too, but he wasn't about to admit it. "Not yet. Let's just keep moving," Peter said, his voice a little less certain now. "It's just the wind." But as they ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just unintelligible sounds. Now they could hear their names being called, the voices familiar yet distorted, as if spoken by someone standing just out of sight. Claire suddenly grabbed Mike's arm, her voice trembling. "I don't like this. Let's turn back." Mike hesitated. He wanted to keep going, to prove that the stories were just that. But something in the air had changed. It felt thicker now, pressing down on them, as if the forest itself was pushing them away. And then, ahead of them, just beyond the next set of trees, a figure appeared. Motionless, silent, it stood between two massive oaks, cloaked in shadow. The whispers stopped. "Who's that?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. No one answered. Are you curious to discover what lurks in the heart of the Whispering Woods? Subscribe now to see what happens next. Chapter 2. The Shadow. The figure stood still as stone, its outline barely distinguishable in the dim light filtering through the dense canopy. For a moment, none of them moved. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if even the forest was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Mike was the first to break the silence. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cutting through the eerie quiet. "Who's there?" The figure did not respond. It didn't even flinch, remaining a dark, unshifting silhouette between the trees. Sarah's breath quickened, her eyes wide as she grabbed Mike's arm, her voice barely audible. "We need to go back," she urged. "Now." But Mike, always the one to push the boundaries, took a step forward, pulling his arm free. "It's probably just someone messing with us," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "Peter, come with me." Peter hesitated, his eyes locked on the figure ahead, but he wasn't about to back down either. "Yeah, let's see who thinks they're funny." The two of them moved cautiously toward the shadowy figure, leaving Claire and Sarah standing a few steps behind. Every footfall seemed too loud in the oppressive silence, the crunch of leaves and twigs echoing in the stillness. The figure remained frozen, watching. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a whisper. The same voice as before, but this time it was clear. Too clear. "Go back." Mike stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his bravado faltering. Peter nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard it." The voice had been unmistakable, chilling in its clarity, and it hadn't come from the figure. It had come from everywhere. Mike swallowed hard and took another step, but as his foot touched the ground, the figure in front of him melted into the shadows. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. "What the?" Mike began, but before he could finish, Claire let out a scream. They all spun around to see Claire staring wide-eyed at the trees behind them. Something's watching us," she gasped, backing away from the forest's edge. Peter scanned the trees, but saw nothing. Still, the sensation was undeniable now. The air had shifted. The whispers had returned, louder this time, circling them, calling their names again and again. "We need to leave," Sarah repeated, her voice rising with panic. "Now!" Mike didn't argue. For the first time, he felt something he rarely experienced. Fear. Pure, unshakable fear. Without another word, they turned and began making their way back toward the entrance of the forest. But it felt different now. The trees seemed closer, the path more twisted and unfamiliar. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was dragging them down. And then, just as they thought they were nearing the edge, they found themselves in front of the same 2 oak trees where the figure had stood. It was as if they hadn't moved at all. "What's happening?" Claire's voice cracked with desperation, her breath coming in shallow gasps. We're going in circles." Mike's heart raced as he looked around. The woods had always had a reputation for trapping people, for making them lose their sense of direction. But this was something more. The forest wasn't just disorienting them, it was keeping them here. The whispers grew louder, pressing in from every side, mocking them, taunting them with the sound of their own names. The darkness between the trees deepened, swallowing the fading light, and for the first time, Mike understood the fear that the townspeople had spoken of. The forest didn't want them to leave. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped again. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. And then it did. From behind them, in the heart of the trees, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't alone. What's following them through the woods? The terror is only beginning. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe for more suspense. Chapter 3. The Pursuit. The footsteps grew louder, their steady rhythm cutting through the silence like the beat of a drum. Each step sent a cold shiver down their spines. Mike's bravado had all but vanished as he spun around, searching for the source. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, bending and stretching, as if something unseen was moving through them. "Run," Peter whispered, his voice tight with fear. He didn't wait for a response. He bolted down the path they had just come from, his long strides quickly carrying him deeper into the forest. Mike, Claire, and Sarah followed, their breaths ragged, their feet pounding against the forest floor. The forest twisted around them, the trees blurring into dark shapes as they ran. No one spoke. The only sound was the rush of their footsteps and the occasional snap of branches underfoot. But the footsteps behind them never stopped. They followed, slow and relentless, always just out of sight but impossibly close. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on an unseen root. She fell to the ground with a sharp cry, scraping her hands on the rough earth. Claire skidded to a stop, reaching out to help her up. "We have to keep moving," Claire urged, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, but as she rose to her feet, she froze. Her eyes widened, staring past Claire, past the trees, to something further ahead. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no." Mike turned to see what she was looking at, and his stomach dropped. Ahead of them, through the trees, was the figure again. It stood still, just as before, its face obscured in shadow, its form blending with the dark forest around it. "It's not possible," Claire muttered. "How?" The figure didn't move, but its presence pressed down on them like a weight. They could feel it, a cold, suffocating energy seeping into their bones, making it hard to breathe. The whispers had returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. "I don't care what it is, we're getting out of here," Mike shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her along as they veered off the path, heading deeper into the woods. They crashed through the underbrush, branches scraping their skin, leaves whipping their faces, but the footsteps continued, always behind them, never slowing. Claire gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "It's like the forest is alive," she panted. It's chasing us." Sarah stumbled again, but this time she caught herself, her eyes wild with panic. "It's not just the forest," she cried. "It's something in it. Something's here with us." They ran without direction, without any sense of where they were going, just trying to put distance between themselves and whatever was stalking them. But no matter how fast they ran, the forest seemed to twist and turn, keeping them trapped in its maze. And then they burst into a small clearing. They stopped, breathing heavily, their eyes darting around the open space. The clearing was empty, save for a large, gnarled tree in the center. Its twisted branches reached high into the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. For a brief moment, there was silence. The footsteps had stopped. The whispers had faded. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. But the sense of safety was an illusion. Sarah's eyes locked onto something at the base of the tree. Her face went pale, her lips parting in a silent scream. "No, no way," she whispered. The others followed her gaze. Scattered around the roots of the tree were objects, old, weathered items. A worn leather journal, a rusted pocket watch, a doll with a missing eye, and clothing, torn, faded clothing, half buried in the earth. Mike stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what they were seeing. These belong to the people who disappeared," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is all that's left of them." A chill swept over the group as the reality sank in. The forest wasn't just cursed. Consumed people, took them and left nothing but remnants. And then the footsteps returned. Louder now, faster. They were no longer creeping up on them. They were coming for them. The figure emerged from the trees, stepping into the clearing. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures appeared, all shrouded in shadow, their movements unnaturally slow, their faces hidden in the darkness. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting, trapped. What are these figures? Will they escape the clearing? Or is it already too late? Subscribe to follow the chilling tale. Chapter 4. The Silent Ones. The figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their forms blending with the darkness of the forest. Silent and unmoving, they seemed to grow out of the shadows, like ancient ghosts born from the depths of the trees. Their faces were hidden, but there was a palpable sense of malice radiating from them, an unnatural stillness that made the air thick with dread. Mike's hands clenched into fists, his breath coming in short gasps. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the terror building inside him. "We need to keep moving." But no one moved. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, her gaze locked on the figures. "They're watching us," she whispered. "They've been watching us this whole time." Peter was the first to take a step back, his legs trembling beneath him. "I don't care what they are," he muttered. "I'm not dying here." But just as he turned to leave the clearing, the figures began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they stepped forward in unison, their movements fluid and haunting. There was something unnatural about the way they walked, like they weren't quite touching the ground. Their dark forms stretched toward the group, and the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with a chorus of voices, each one cold and threatening. Claire grabbed Mike's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to go," she urged, her voice shaking. Now." Without another word, they bolted. Mike led the charge, his feet pounding against the soft earth as they darted back into the thick forest. The trees seemed closer now, their branches weaving together above, forming a suffocating canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The figures didn't give chase, but the whispers followed them. They wrapped around the group like a tightening noose, growing louder with each step. The path ahead seemed to stretch into endless darkness, and every turn felt like a dead end, as though the forest was twisting itself to trap them. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her panic rising with each step. "We're not going to make it," she cried. "We're never going to get out. Just keep running," Mike shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. He couldn't deny the fear clawing at his chest. The forest felt alive, like it was watching their every move, shifting, twisting, and closing in. But no matter how far they ran, they never seemed to escape the whispers. It was as if the forest itself was alive, drawing them deeper into its cursed heart. Suddenly, Peter skidded to a stop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Wait!" he shouted, spinning around. "We've been here before." The group stopped, their chests heaving as they took in their surroundings. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They were back at the same clearing. The gnarled tree loomed before them, its twisted branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. Scattered at its base were the same objects, remnants of the lost souls who had entered the forest before them. "No," Claire gasped, stumbling back in disbelief. "This can't be happening." Mike's hands were trembling as he looked around, desperately searching for a way out. But the forest had closed in, thick and impenetrable, leaving them trapped in the same spot they had tried so hard to escape. Sarah collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "It's the curse," she sobbed. "We're trapped, just like the others." Peter stared at the tree, his face pale. "This is where it happens," he muttered, his voice hollow. "This is where they take you." The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to shift again. The figures reappeared, emerging from the darkness, their numbers growing. They moved silently, circling the group like predators closing in on their prey. There was no escape. The forest had claimed them. Mike clenched his fists, his jaw tight with defiance. "I'm not giving up," he growled, his voice low. "There has to be a way out." But as the figures moved closer, their whispers growing louder and more insistent, the reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy weight. They were surrounded. The forest wasn't going to let them leave. And then, out of the silence, came a voice. Clear, calm, and eerily familiar, it echoed through the clearing. "You shouldn't have come." They all froze, their heads whipping around in search of the speaker. But there was no one else there. The voice continued, low and threatening. "Now you belong to the forest." The clearing darkened, the shadows lengthening, stretching toward them. The figures were no longer just watching, they were moving in. Slowly, methodically, they began to close the circle, their whispers growing louder, their faces still hidden in shadow. Mike looked at his friends, the fear in their eyes matching his own. He could feel the forest closing in, tightening around them, suffocating them. They were out of time. The figures are closing in, and time is running out. Will they escape, or has the forest claimed them for good? Subscribe to uncover the chilling conclusion. Chapter 5. The Escape. The figures moved closer, their presence pressing in on the group like a tangible force. The whispers were deafening now, circling them. Their names hissed over and over in a terrifying chorus. The clearing seemed smaller, the darkness more oppressive, as if the forest itself was closing in, ready to swallow them whole. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the fear threatening to overtake him, but he pushed it down. There had to be a way out. There had to be something they hadn't tried. Sarah sobbed quietly, still on her knees, her eyes wide with terror as the shadows loomed closer. Claire stood frozen, her back to the twisted tree, her breath shallow. Peter's hands were trembling, his face pale as he tried to keep his composure. But even he seemed to have lost hope. The circle of figures was tightening. They were running out of time. Mike took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We're not dead yet," he said, his voice firm despite the rising panic inside him. "There's got to be a way out of this." "How?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "We've tried everything. We keep ending up back here." Mike glanced around the clearing, his eyes scanning the twisted branches, the remnants of those who had been lost before them. The tree stood in the center, gnarled and ancient, its roots digging deep into the cursed earth. And then it hit him. "The tree," he said suddenly. "It's the center of all this. It's where they left their things. It's where the figures always appear. It's where the curse is strongest." Peter frowned, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You think the tree is the source?" Mike nodded. "I think it's connected somehow. If we can break whatever hold the tree has on this place, maybe we can break the curse." Sarah wiped her tear-streaked face, her voice shaky. "But how? What do we do?" Mike looked at the tree's thick, twisted trunk, its branches reaching upward like a cage. His eyes locked on the base of the tree, where the scattered belongings of the lost souls lay half-buried in the earth. "We have to destroy it," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "We have to destroy the tree." Peter's eyes widened. "You're crazy. That thing is ancient. We don't have any tools." "We don't need tools," Mike replied, stepping forward toward the base of the tree. "We just need to dig. We need to unearth whatever's buried here. There's something keeping this place cursed, and we're going to find it." Without waiting for a response, Mike dropped to his knees and began to claw at the dirt with his hands. The ground was hard, packed tight by years of neglect, but he didn't stop. He dug furiously, his fingers scraping against the earth, ignoring the pain. Peter hesitated, then followed suit, kneeling beside Mike and using his hands to dig into the ground. Claire joined them next, her fingers trembling as she pulled at the soil. Finally, Sarah crawled over, her breath coming in shaky gasps, and started to dig too. As they dug, the whispers grew louder, angrier. The figures were closing in, their dark forms looming just beyond the circle of light. But the group didn't stop. They kept digging, their fingers raw and bloodied, as the earth slowly gave way beneath them. And then, after what felt like hours, Mike's hand hit something hard. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "I found something." The others stopped digging, their eyes wide with anticipation. Mike carefully cleared the dirt away, revealing a smooth, cold surface. It was a stone, dark, ancient, and etched with strange markings that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. Claire gasped. "What is that?" "I don't know," Mike replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's the source. I can feel it." Peter reached out to touch the stone, but as his fingers brushed against it, the air around them seemed to shift. The whispers stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was only silence. The figures, which had been advancing steadily, paused, their dark forms standing still at the edge of the clearing. And then the ground beneath them began to shake. The stone pulsed with light, growing brighter and brighter as the earth trembled beneath their feet. The gnarled tree began to creak and groan, its twisted branches swaying as if caught in a violent wind. The figures at the edge of the clearing let out a low, collective moan, their forms flickering like shadows in the dying light. Mike gritted his teeth and grabbed the stone with both hands, yanking it free from the earth. As soon as it left the ground, the shaking stopped. The whispers ceased. The figures froze. For a moment, everything was still. And then, with a deafening crack, the tree split down the middle. The figures at the edge of the clearing let out a wail, their forms dissolving into smoke, disappearing into the darkness as the tree collapsed inward, crumbling into ash. The stone in Mike's hands shattered, its pieces vanishing into the wind. The forest was silent. The curse had been broken. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.